Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pints with Ayre. I'm Brent Heffley, the Sales and Marketing Director. I'm here with Ariel Brown, our VP and Senior Engineer, and Ryan Berry, our CEO and Expert Technician. Welcome, everyone, and cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. All right, you got the little tulip glass out there, Ariel. I love it.
Yeah, I just got this along with the beers today.
Nice. Nice. And I see you guys have something dark there too.
Oh, that is amazing. That was my first sip, and that is phenomenal.
Awesome. Well, don't hold us in suspense. What have you got?
So this is our most local brewery. It's probably half a mile away. It's Gun Barrel Brewing, Midnight Rider Porter.
Oh yeah.
And it's super smooth, really nice and malty. It's just, that is way too easy.
That looks like a good pre-Thanksgiving, because we're one day before Thanksgiving as we're recording this.
Yep.
Beer to have. Nice. I kind of went in a similar vein, but I went non-local for the first time. I hadn't had this in a while, and I was so tempted by it at the store the other day. It's an AleSmith beer.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, San Diego, California. Their nut brown English style brown ale. It's super tasty, super traditional. But yeah, it's just that time of year. I love it. Dark beer season.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, today we are changing it up, and we're going to answer some viewer questions, which is great. Everyone out there watching, your response to this series has been tremendous. I love it. We've gotten a lot of questions. We're going to tackle a couple in this episode, and we'll tackle a few more later on. But let's go ahead and jump into it. And the first one is actually asked by a couple of people, and it's about equipment break-in. We always hear about burn-in or break-in, or getting the equipment from brand new to really listenable, because we all know that takes some time. So, there's a few different parts of that. People want to know what happens, how long does it take on average, and what are the sonic changes. Mm-hmm. So I know there's probably not a specific answer to this, but what do we think happens during break-in when we go from a brand new unit that's been put together, it's been tested, but it hasn't really been played, to one that's, broken in? Right.
Yeah. So at the smallest level, I don't have a definitive answer there. Our hypothesis has been that, particularly with things like the circuit board material and capacitors, these things that have basically have a distinct dielectric component to them, as well as even wires, like like for instance the Cardus wire we use. Mm-hmm. And so which even it has a jack, as well as the strands itself. The way we think about it is that particularly the dielectric and the wire is made up of molecules that have kind of a grain structure, and molecules and particularly dielectric, where where those molecules are kind of can be oriented a certain way. And so I think it's potentially all those things kind of settling in and then kind of aligning to the electrical environment that's being applied to them, settling into the environment. We know that for instance in our sound room, when we move the cables, when we're changing something or move the cables, that disrupts the system. It takes the cables a little while for them to settle back into their new position.
Right.
So, and again, I'm not quite smart enough to know exactly what's happening at that molecular level. But that's, working with and talking with Charlie for a couple of decades, that was kind of our kind of working hypothesis.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose that can be, circuit boards could be part of that, traces, input.
Or, copper traces, the solder, So potentially, I don't know how far to go,
Right.
know,
Right. You can
even
kind of
the,
take that down the rabbit hole.
the substrate that the resistive elements are put on, and the coatings on those, and
Yeah.
I don't know how far it goes, but
Yeah.
I mean, like Ariel said, it's hard to talk about the theory of it, and what's exactly happening in it, and that's kind of a topic that's been debated for quite a while in audio, because there's a question: is it actually changing on a physical level? Is it a psychological perception that we think it sounds better after we're getting used to the system for amount of time? And it can be hard to tell. We have kind of an advantage being a manufacturer where we get to listen to something new versus something old, side by side. And so I can say it's again, it's an efficacious thing. We don't necessarily have the exact explanation of what's necessarily going on, but we do know that there is definitely a change between a new board and an older board. And you can listen to two different units that have been burned in, some demo pieces, for example, that have been traveling around the country for several months,
Right.
and get those in, and you can expect them to sound relatively the same. But if you build a brand new unit and put it out there and put it in the same system, it will sound different than the other two. And that's something that we repeated time and time and time again, even when we have had a situation where, we're doing a new design and we have to replace the boards. We know, oh, okay, well, sound tests are going to be tricky again because everything has changed. It's not just the circuit that's changing now. We've got this whole break-in process to readjust to. And, we need to give this thing time to kind of settle down before you can really do your serious listening to it, because otherwise you're going to get skewed and be like, oh, it sounds, overly bright or, overly whatever. And you're going to adjust to it and then find out, after the unit's been sitting around for several months and running, all of a sudden everything that you wanted to tweak to is not necessarily always true. So it's a tricky situation. And you got that, and then you also have another thing that people ask about a lot is the warm up and cold process, because
that's our next question, which we'll get to in a second here. Okay. But let me ask something else too, because this has come up a number of times, and you need to break in, particularly on a preamp, each input in a way. The main body of the circuit will, as the path travels through there, that'll be broken in. But if you've never used, say, input 3, from that RCA plug to the main board, that section has to break in as well, right?
There's a degree of that.
I mean, if you want to be a perfectionist, certainly, that's true. And in the black and white, viewpoint of things, when you're talking about how much of the circuit is different, it's pretty minimal.
It probably depends on the particular product.
Yeah, oftentimes it's a port and a short trace to a chip that you're using for other reasons anyway. So
this has come up before in comparison tests where it's somebody's brought in a new piece of equipment, plugged it into port input 2, which has never been used before. Oh, I expected this to sound better doing an AB, and that's it's different because that you have to take that piece into account as well.
Yeah, it can be. Like I said, I think the difference is pretty minimal in that case, and that's where you get into where there's a difference between burning in and being obsessive about it. Where audio should be fun, and it should be a process that you enjoy, and
obsessively fun.
And like when you're sitting there, trying to burn in every port for 140 hours to try to get every single port burn in equally, you're going to go mad trying to get the system just right. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, theoretically it would make a difference, but in practicality, would I recommend somebody move their port and burn the unit in over and over and over again until all 10 inputs on a QX5 is done, or all 8 inputs on a KXR is done, or whatever? Not necessarily,
No, but probably something to keep in mind if you are looking up a new piece, trying to do an A/B comparison.
If you switch to a different port and you're listening to it, and it's like, it doesn't sound quite right. Yeah, that might be something you might want to try, is give it, a few days of settling in to see if it changes.
Yeah. So you just touched on one of the sub questions here is, how long does break-in take? I know that it's an open question. Some of our different products will take different amounts of time.
Yeah. which I generally attribute to, is the specific circuit board material used and the specific capacitor dielectrics used.
Sure.
So I think that, unfortunately, it seems like most of our higher quality materials that are used in our top tier products generally take longer.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's the bulk of it is the board material is probably the largest contributor to that effect. You are looking at the R series. It can take quite a bit longer. Where people are still hearing some changes over several months. Where they can be 4 or 5 months into the thing and they're still like, oh yeah, I think it's still settling in a little bit.
Yeah.
It's about there. And the amount of change you hear with break-in is a diminishing curve. So it's always going down on how much you're hearing from week to week or month to month or whatever. But it seems to tail out a lot longer on the higher end materials, where in the kind of the midline for air.
Yep.
It's much quicker where we're talking a couple of months before you're really kind of about there, and it's pretty much done where, and then just kind of it really depends on the number of capacitors, things like that. So each product's a little different.
Right. Now, what would you guys say, and I know this is going to be kind of a gut feel question, but in terms of just having the unit on, plugged in, powered up versus actually playing music through the circuit, in terms of break-in, does just having it on attribute a decent amount to it, or do you really need to be playing it? And because out there in the world there are all kinds of different break-in discs that runs the system through its paces, or people have their own tricks to try to burn things in quicker.
I mean, that I think that power on will get it part way there. I think that's certainly part of it, but I think that like running actual signal is I think it's probably is more or less required to get to fully
and I always
recommend every piece of it.
Right.
And I recognize when you're running, I recommend when you're running it, just turn the volume down at night. It doesn't have to be full listenable volume all the time. I mean, even if you have the thing turned down in your system running at a really quiet, almost on a level that you wouldn't be able to hear outside of the room.
Yeah, or you can put your amps on mute if you're breaking in a preamp or source or something like that. If you wanted to, you could.
I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I would leave the whole system running, just have it turned down to a minimal volume, because depending on how the amplifier responds to that, there might be situations where you're shorting out the signal, and you don't want to necessarily do that on the on the DAC or whatever, and just let it go through the whole system.
Right. All right. Final part of this question is, what are some of the sonic changes that we experience during the break-in process? What improves in the product?
Sure.
Right.
The biggest report that I hear mostly and that I've experienced is, I think, for air gear particularly, because I can only say for air, I haven't really broken into many other people's gear, but I think the initial sound's a little bright, a little harsh. So the clarity is definitely always there, but the warmth and the sound, the kind of musicality of it, so to speak, that's something that shows up a little bit more as time goes on. So when you first turn it on, I've heard some people go, wow, this is a lot brighter than I remember it being in the demo.
Right.
And I go, well, yeah, give it some time. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, they call me back like, oh yeah, now it's starting to sound what I would expect it to be. So that's really the biggest change, I think, is just kind of taming down that little bit of brightness that it gets at the beginning.
Sure. Yeah, I've also experienced stuff that seems compressed or really small in its sound that opens up over time. And it's sometimes when you put multiple things in a system, you've got all kinds of break-in going on. So you can have all kinds of crazy effects that happen. And just
speakers it's not just an electronics thing. This is speakers, this is cables, this is the electronics themselves. It's everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've moved other stuff just to put this piece in place, the cables, all of that. So complex thing. Cool. So what you started to touch on earlier, Ryan, the standby or low power mode versus powering a piece of equipment off. You know,
Well, and I think, so the powering it off, so, there's definitely an effect that we know that happens with, like capacitors, for example. When a capacitor is warmer, its level of capacitance changes ever so slightly. So, there's definitely measurable differences between warm components and cold components. And we know that not only is everything tuned to be warm, when we do listening tests and when we design the gear, it's all tuned to be in that warm state. We also know that in general, things just sound better when they've got that temperature to them. So, kind of a nice thing, nice effect of the linear power amplifiers, because, there's always the negatives of the efficiency and how hot they get and things like that. The nice thing is they act as kind of like little ovens, and that bit of oven effect actually helps the electronics quite a bit in reaching their full sonic potential, I guess.
Right, their operating temperature.
Mm-hmm. So when you turn a unit completely off, you are discharging everything. Everything's just, no power is coming into the unit. We switch it off at the breaker, or you unplug it, or whatever you do. Yep. Nothing's coming in. Everything's stone cold. With the air gear, Charlie and Ariel have designed everything that the critical components effectively stay on in most cases. So amplifiers, we of course turn off the bias. That's the main current draw on an amplifier. So it'll run significantly cooler, but other sections of the circuit, like the preamplifiers, the input stages of the amplifiers, things like that, those are left effectively on and receiving power, so they have some temperature to them.
Right.
Preamplifier, it's really hard to turn off, so to speak. We mute it effectively, we turn off the display, but we're not really, shutting everything internally down, just because it doesn't make sense to do so. It doesn't draw much current on its own anyway.
Right. So coming out of a standby versus coming out of full power off, what do you think is probably, an average time? Like if you're just taking it out of standby, amp, preamp, source, is 20 minutes and you're up to operating temperature pretty much, and you're going? Is it a little longer than that for the amplifier? A little shorter than that for the source?
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of, I would say it really kind of depends on the thermal mass of the entire unit. For instance, like a KXR or something, it has such a heavy chassis, it actually takes quite a bit of time to actually get everything up to thermal equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas something, something like a small DAC or something is going to, come up pretty quick, 15 minutes or something.
Sure.
Yeah, or even like two similar circuits, like an MXR and a VX5, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They're amplifiers, right? Like one's a solid billet of aluminum. That takes quite a bit to heat all that up, whereas
it takes, hour and a half or two,
mm-hmm.
hours more or less.
So
VX5 will be up in a half an hour.
Right. So is that just coming out of standby, or is that from stone cold?
Well, for the power amplifiers, that's, because the majority of that is the output stage. There's not really much difference in getting up to from off or standby to full temperature. That's pretty much the same for a power amplifier. There's not going to be that much difference there.
Okay.
There will be a difference as far as a source or a preamp, because in standby, it's from standby to on, there's no difference. I mean, it is basically ready to go right then.
Yeah, it turns on the display effectively.
Turn on.
Right. So now here's the $1 million question. The question I've heard asked a lot is, what effect do each of these have on the potential lifespan of a product? Keeping it at its operating temperature most of the time, more of a steady state, versus the take it all the way down, no power, back up when you're listening, back down after you're done, where you've got those changes.
So I guess there's two different levels in that. There's one that's, going from standby to on, and there's one from going completely off to on, which is, two pretty different things in what's happening inside the units. So, just from my previous experience with capacitors, they all have lifetimes, as we all know.
Sure.
When you're talking solid state, the one thing that ages effectively is more or less the capacitors, your electrolytics.
Electrolytic capacitors specifically, yes. They're probably the one thing in a piece of audio gear that actually will age and degrade over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no such
temperature is the primary factor.
All right. So one question that we get a lot is, should I turn my equipment off or just put it in standby, which is going to result in the longer lifespan for one of my Air products. So what do we recommend to people? Should they just leave it powered on full all the time? Should they put it in standby when they're not listening? Or when they're not listening, should they just turn it off, completely, which is basically like unplugging it from the wall? What do you guys think?
Right. So again, I would separate that into two categories. So power amps and everything else, most likely, because DACs, preamps, sources, other things like that generally run at much lower temperatures, and so the only real component within an electronic piece of gear that is really going to degrade over time are the electrolytic capacitors.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really primarily a factor of temperature. I mean, temperature and voltage. But so as long as they're not run, as long as there's a good safety factor on the voltage, the primary factor is temperature. And so most preamps or DACs, they're going to be running nowhere near the rated temperature. So their lifespan is going to be decades, a few decades easily.
Right. It gets through the shelf life before anything at that point.
Yeah. So as long as they are powered on and they are, keeping their oxide layer formed by the application of voltage current, they'll be fine for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Now, power amp, where you're actually many designs where actually the temperature is significantly higher than its other product, so they're getting closer to their ratings. And so, the first thing I'll say is that I would not recommend completely powering off the products. I think there's potential risks with the turn on surge. Especially like every day, especially to avoid those surges. And so I think that leaving them either in standby or fully on is going to be the safest bet there. Now, between standby and power on, there's putting it in standby will reduce the temperature, at least of Air products, significantly. And so based on the fact that a capacitor's lifespan is significantly based on the temperature, you will increase the lifespan of the electrolytic capacitors by putting it in standby and saving that time spent at high temperature.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, within an Air product, it's still a couple of factors below their temperature ratings, and so even if it's on full time, I wouldn't expect to see significant degradation of the electrolytic capacitors for at least a decade or a decade and a half, depending on the actual temperature run. So, here at Ayre, we generally leave the amplifiers on full time. They're at full temperature all the time. That's what we prefer to do. We always potentially need to be able to listen, anytime, any day.
2 a.m. on a Thursday.
Right.
Never know.
Right. But if you are really, really concerned about, the aging process and the actual lifespan of the product, theoretically, turning it off every evening, every night, overnight, will increase the lifespan of the capacitors.
To the point of putting it in standby, effectively.
Right. Putting it in standby, because just going from standby, because in standby, the capacitors are still fully charged. There's just no draw on them, and so and the output stage is unbiased, and so 90% of that temperature is taken away. So they will last a long time that way. So that is my best recommendation, based on what your level of comfort is.
Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, we see primarily here the capacitors fail in one of two ways. It's most often a unit that's been in a basement for 6 years or whatever, that they found, or has been unplowed because, somebody passed away and they inherited it and it was found in the basement or something, and the first thing they do is power it on, and that, everything, the caps are no longer formed, and that causes a failure. And
yeah, that can be a fairly catastrophic and dramatic failure, and that's caused because when a capacitor sits on the shelf or sits unpowered, that voltage, the actual oxide layer, which is basically what a aluminum electrolytic capacitor depends on, it basically deforms, or it basically loses that oxide layer, and so the application of voltage and current actually forms that oxide layer, and actually relies on that oxide layer to actually operate. So, even if we buy capacitors here and it sits on the shelf for several years before we use them, we have to be really careful with that. They actually have a shelf life. In certain cases, we actually have there is a process you can use to actually reform the oxide layer. It's pretty tedious, and so we don't like to do that. So, so we need to be really careful with, our usage of capacitors and how long they sit on the shelf, because if you just power them on first time, they can fail dramatically.
so a real tricky thing with the whole ordering thing, because we use fairly specialized caps and whatnot, and you're really tempted to order a whole bunch of them to get the price savings and have them on hand, and not have to wait the 4+ months of making new ones that it can sometimes take. And
Right.
so you want to get like 5 years supply of them, but you do that, and then you run into exactly what Ariel's saying. All of a sudden you have 5-year-old capacitors sitting on the shelf, and now I don't think that they necessarily fail on the shelf life that in that time, but they're getting closer, and you don't want to necessarily do that. So we try to do what we can to have a 1-year supply at all the time to make sure we're keeping those fresh.
Yep.
Great. I think that's a very helpful answer for everyone out there. So third question, and this is a little bit more ephemeral. It's the IBE disc, the irrational but efficacious disc. And this is something we produced as a CD for a while. It originally came from Cardis Audio. George Cardis made the record of that. Probably, I think back in the 80s originally. And I remember Charlie telling the story of asking him, or telling him, why don't you make a CD? People would love that. And he's like, I don't want to bother with that. Why don't you do it? So we did. But the question is, what in the world, right? Like this is a little bit, ventures a little bit into the woo-woo, but we all hear the difference. We use it all the time. So one of the questions is, how do you use it, right? There are a number of tracks on there, 2 specifically, a 1-minute sweep and a 5-minute sweep, that we use pretty often. So in our standard, say our listening test standard, how do we use it at Ayre that we can let people know if they want to replicate it at home?
Yeah, so certainly whenever we starting listening test, or whenever we make a small change within a listening test, the first thing we do is typically play that 1-minute track. Again, it more or less it accelerates that kind of settling of the system. So I mean, you could think of it as more or less accelerating that kind of break-in, kind of settling time. So to help us do quicker listening tests.
Right.
And we do, we can do the longer one, less often, but between, I'm not even quite sure what a reasonable, so.
Right. Once a week, or maybe
once a week,
the
kind of
system's been off
like
for a while. Let it
between major listening sessions.
Yeah.
Ryan?
So is that?
You have thoughts on that? How we use the IBE disc, or how you use the IBE disc for listening tests?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is just getting the refresh factor of that first track is probably one of our biggest go-tos. It's a weird, as the disc title describes, it's a weird thing that doesn't always make sense, but there are times where we'll be listening and, you come to these conclusions with listening tests and you're like, it doesn't make sense. Like what we thought last week isn't agreeing with what's going on this week. And you run that disc, you put it in there, you leave the room, you run the first track, come back 60 seconds later and the whole system sounds different. It's the darndest thing, and it's always interesting where it gets to the point where you almost get obsessive about making sure you run it, because you'll realize you've wasted an entire day on all of this listening. And I'm to the point now where it's like, God, I almost want to run it like once a day when I'm listening to my system.
Oh yeah.
That at least that first track, again, is 60 seconds out of the day.
Yep.
I wouldn't like to run it more than that. I think that there's some things that happen that are strange when you run it back to back to back. So, people might be tempted to like throw it in there on a loop on that track, and, it doesn't necessarily do good things to the sound.
Right.
And so it's the Goldilocks scenario where, one's too much, one's too little, but then there's the just right. And, it just feels like, once a day, once a week for me, whatever it is, depending on how much I'm sitting down and listening, it really does make an effect on that system, which I can't explain, but I've never heard it be worse in anything. Like, it doesn't matter if it's running air gear or running, somebody else's gear, it just sounds better after it's done. And,
Yep.
It's a weird disc, but, I'm glad we have it. And, I'm really happy that it exists out there, because it does make a big difference for that whole listening experience.
Oh, it's amazing. It's one of the first things I loaded on my Pono player when I got that.
Mm-hmm.
And talk about night and day.
Which is great until you run the thing in shuffle and all of a sudden it does that to you.
Yeah, that's a rude awakening.
That white noise track.
Great. So let me ask the easier question, the follow-up question first. How long do you think that effect lasts? If you put that in, what's the time you think it before doing it again?
Well, that's hard to say, because I don't know if I imagine it's a matter of time, as opposed to like time running,
right.
On the, so like passing active signal through versus letting the unit or, the system sit idle. Mm-hmm. I imagine it's just a matter of, how long it takes to, I don't know what it does, settle back in or whatever happens in the system where you want to run it again. But
I can say from experiences at shows that doing it each morning before a show starts definitely has an effect. So once a day is not too much.
No, I wouldn't agree. I would agree with that for sure.
Yeah. Totally.
So, but beyond that, unless you're going to listen for like 12 hours and you stop for lunch for an hour and want to come back, or like if you're doing crazy listening tests, which is
when we're moving things around, you might get multiple runs a day because we move cables around and we've shifted everything. Plug new systems back in, we like to refresh it then.
Yep.
But for the average incidence, I'd say once a day would probably be what you want to do it at. And I like I said, I don't think having system actively passing signal or not makes a difference in that regard. I think it's just the amount of time it needs to be done.
All right. Now the trick question here is, what does it do? And we know that there really isn't an answer to that, but what are some thoughts of what that might be doing in the system?
Right. So the analogy that I use, and this is kind of, I think, even George's theory is it's kind of like degaussing, and it's more or less, as electronics are playing signal, there are charges that builds up, and there's magnetic elements that get magnetized, and so it more or less demagnetizes and kind of releases the charge on it, brings everything back to center, back to zero, so that everything it's back where it should be. And because we know from experience, with even ferrets, and we know that when things are magnetized or charged up, it affects the sound negatively. Yep. And so you want everything to be at equilibrium, at its neutral state. And we think that this if you've seen some of those some of those like experiments and videos of where you can apply a frequency and basically generate a resonance, let's say either to a water stream or to like sand on a table, and basically everything aligns with a frequency. And so with this sweep, we're basically collecting, let's say, all these charges or electrons, wherever. So we collect them, and then we kind of force them back to the middle, more or less. Back to zero charge, back to 0 volts, or whatever it is.
Right.
I have actually a question that's kind of not one that somebody else asked, but I get asked fairly often is the IBE disk's proper use. So like when they have a new unit, do we recommend burning it in a loop? Do we recommend using the disk at all to burn in the system? What do you guys think on that? This was IBE disk was something that actually came out a little bit before I started working with Ayre. So I think you guys might have a better insight on that than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's better for like setup and for prep. I generally don't recommend it for burn-in. I recommend a much more varied music selection for actual burn-in.
Okay.
Although I don't think it hurts to run that periodically while
Right.
you're burning it in. I don't think that would hurt for sure. But
so running the disk all the way through would be beneficial every now and then, or would you like look at running specific tracks?
I would just do the 5-minute sweep, because the brown noise and the white noise stuff in between, I'm not sure how much beneficial effect that would probably really have. But
yeah,
I mean,
we threw those on there. I mean, those used to be some more common like setup and measurement kind of tracks. I don't know that. I mean, theoretically, like white noise, should almost be the ideal break-in source.
yeah.
I mean, I've always told people that the best type of thing to use to burn in or break in a system is the music you're going to be listening to. So that's what you're going to be doing. Run that through the system, of course, and then you're letting the system experience what you're going to be exposing it to for years to come. So
Right. Nice. All right. Well, those are good questions. Thanks for the input on the answers, guys. If anyone watching this has other questions you'd like to see us address, send it to pints@ayre.com, and we'll try to get it on an upcoming episode. Until then, cheers and happy listening.
cheers.